everyone, and welcome to this really short video lesson that I've put together for you, just so we can keep on top of our work and that we can complete our booklet on classical conditioning and operant conditioning ready for Friday, because obviously with good reason, but we are missing a couple of lessons on Monday, and I really don't want us to fall kind of behind in terms of the rest of the year group. So I thought I'd just do this quick video for you so that you can get your booklets filled in and we can hopefully make good progress on Friday. So if you open up your booklet, all right, and turn to I think it's page 5, I believe, which is where we were up to the last time I saw you on Friday. So we'd already briefly introduced the concepts of classical conditioning on Monday's lesson, and then on Friday, again, because we didn't really have much time after the initial assessment and the fire drill, we'd kind of refreshed some of the key concepts and we were working on some of the terminology. So we've already kind of completed this page in our booklet. Hopefully you've already highlighted some of the key terms, i.e. that classical conditioning is learning through association, and then a little bit about how Pavlov actually investigated that, how he actually completed his conditioning tasks with dogs. So this is a slide that we were working on again on Friday, and you were all pretty good, it has to be said, in terms of knowing and understanding these correct bits of terminology and actually how it applied to Pavlov. So really, really well done there. I think where we'd come unstuck a little bit was trying to complete the next page in your booklet when I asked you to come up with an example of your own. So that's what we're going to start with in this little video lesson, just to refresh it for those of you who have maybe found this concept a little bit tricky thus far. All right. So we're firstly gonna put classical conditioning in the context of the Little Albert study, which is one of the studies that you were introduced to as part of your SIL. So we're going to go ahead and fill this in on page 6. It says in your booklet to explain how the case of Little Albert demonstrates classical conditioning. So we can go ahead and we can make a general statement there if you fill it in to your booklets for me. So you can say that Little Albert learnt to associate white rats and the fear that he experienced when the bang was made behind his head. Thus he developed a phobia of white rats. But we could go kind of one step further if you want, and we can start to apply some of the key terminologies to the case of Little Albert. So kind of keep with me here, and we'll just make these key notes in this space for Little Albert, and the more we repeat it, the better your understanding will be. So, in the case of Little Albert, the neutral stimulus would have been the white rat. Okay, to begin with, Little Albert had no fear associated with that particular object. He was what we call trialed with a number of objects to see what he was afraid of and what he wasn't, and the white rat was one of the things that he had no fear of whatsoever. So before any conditioning took place, the neutral stimulus would have been the white rat. However, also before conditioning, they obviously had to find a stimulus that he was automatically afraid of. So that's where the steel bar comes in. So the loud noise, the striking of the steel bar, would be classed as an unconditioned stimulus. It's a stimulus that he did not need to learn to be afraid of. It was an automatic or a reflex thing that he reacted to. So his fear then is classed as an unconditioned response. So to clarify, the NS before any conditioning was the white rat. The UCS, the unconditioned stimulus, is the loud noise, and the unconditioned response is fear. So during conditioning, obviously the white rat and the loud noise are repeatedly paired together until eventually the white rat goes on to become a conditioned stimulus. Remember, conditioned is just a different word for learned, okay? So we're saying that the white rat is now a learned stimulus. Little Albert has learnt how to respond to that. Thus, his response of fear is now a conditioned response. It's a learnt response. It's one that he didn't previously have towards that stimulus, but now he has learnt via association that when in the presence of the white rat, his learnt response is fear. So making sure that we've got that filled in on the bottom of page 6. Moving forward again, and there's no kind of space initially in your booklet for this, but I'm just going to go through it again, just because I know that it is quite a tough concept. So just to clarify, when I'm talking about all the different types of stimuli and responses, this is what I'm referring to. So when I've previously mentioned that for little Albert, the white rat was an NS, this is things in our environment where we don't have a natural reflex response towards them. So they don't really typically affect our behaviour. We have no reaction to them whatsoever. So for example, and I'm going to use the example kind of going through, seeing a feather would be a neutral stimulus to begin with, okay? Without some sort of learnt experience, we wouldn't really have any sort of response towards a feather, okay? So that would be a neutral stimulus. Following on from that, we then have unconditioned stimuli. So these are stimulus materials in our environment which have an automatic response in us. They produce a reflex reaction in humans. So for example, like in the case of little Albert, and like with my feather example, a loud noise. The unconditioned response towards a loud noise in a human is to be afraid, it's to panic, it's to jump. So that then leads us into the UCR. An unconditioned response is an unlearned reflex response. So it's something that's automatically there towards one of those unconditioned stimuli. All right, so the startle reflex, the UCR, is what we would have in response to a loud noise, as I've just said. So during the conditioning process, the two are paired together. And if that's repeated numerous times, then the two stimuli become what we call associated, until eventually what began as a neutral stimulus, in this example the feather, has now gone on to become a conditioned stimulus, because the two things have been paired together. So we now associate that feather with the onset of the loud noise, and now after repeated pairings or a traumatic pairing, that new response of being afraid of the feather has been learnt. So that's the conditioned stimulus. And obviously that's where we get the conditioned response from. So the feather, independently of the loud noise now, will produce a new learned response of fear. So we're going to go ahead now and fill this into your booklet. Some of you, I think, had managed to already do this example on Friday, but if you were struggling, which several of you were, then you obviously need to use this example now so that you've got something on page 7. So I'd like you to go ahead and utilise the terms at the bottom. So we've got feather used 3 times. We've got loud noise used twice, and we've got fear used twice as well. And obviously we clarified on page 7 there is an error, so you want to get rid of the NS in the box, in the row for after conditioning. So go ahead and do that for me now, and we'll obviously check that everybody's got that filled in on Friday. So pause this here and just make sure you've got something correct into that space. So moving on, we're just going to look at some more what we would call novel stimulus materials, because this, guys, is what you would actually be doing in your exam. You would be provided with a short stimuli, and you would have to try and very quickly work out what the bits of terminology were in relation to the classical conditioning process, and then you're going to have to be able to write it out in a paragraph as well, which we'll do in a few moments. So the first example in your booklet is Lila is a professional photographer. She often takes photos of people indoors using a flash. The camera makes a whirring noise when the picture is taken. Layla has noticed that most people blink the first couple of times that the flash goes off. If she then takes a picture without the flash, they still blink. So, just before I put the right answers up, just have a read of it. You might want to annotate that, see if you can figure out the pack of 5 terminology before I give you the answer. So maybe just have a quick think of it, pause it. Okay, so let's go through the right answers here then. So, the unconditioned response in this situation is the blinking, okay? It's the reflex reaction that they're having automatically towards that flash. The unconditioned stimulus is the whirring, okay? So it's actually the whirring that is causing the people to blink initially, all right? And the flash, obviously, that goes with that. The neutral stimulus is the camera. So the camera, in this instance, creates no response in the audience to begin with, all right? But then that camera goes on to become the conditioned stimulus, because it says here that by the time the conditioning process is over, i.e. she's taken numerous photographs, they are blinking just in the presence of the camera. All right, so she's taking a photo and they have now learnt a response towards that camera. And that is because they have associated the camera with the whirring and the subsequent flash. And that means that they blink. So a new condition response, a learnt response, just in the presence of the camera. And that's all because of that whirring followed by the flash. Okay. Next example in your booklet. Cancer patients receiving chemotherapy frequently develop nausea and vomiting as a result of the chemicals. After several treatments, some patients actually develop nausea at the sight of a nurse. So again, you might want to try and figure it out first, but then I will give you the right answers. Okay, so the UCR is the chemotherapy. That's the wrong way around. I apologise. That should be the sickness. Sorry. The UCR, the unconditioned response, is the sickness. The unconditioned stimulus, therefore, is the chemotherapy. Apologies. I've just got it the wrong way around. I expected it to be UCS first, which it normally is. So then the neutral stimulus in this scenario is the nurse, and then it's the nurse that we're going on to form a learnt association towards. So the nurse goes from being a neutral stimulus, i.e. the nurse produces no response whatsoever to begin with, but she becomes a learnt stimuli, and now just in the presence of the nurse on her own, because we've got a learnt association between the nurse, the chemotherapy and the vomiting, just the presence of the nurse without the chemotherapy is enough to induce nausea. Okay, so there are a few more examples for you to just get to grips with the terminology. I'd like you to now go ahead and complete this worksheet for me. Okay, so I've given you all the appropriate kind of bits that you need to pop in. Remember, whenever we're describing classical conditioning, you should be doing it in kind of before, during and after stages. So go ahead now and complete that for me, please. Okay. Time to check our answers then. So before conditioning, we've got a neutral stimulus, which is the clown. We've got the clown producing no response in the first instance. We've also got an unconditioned stimulus, which is the balloon popping, and a UCR of fear. During conditioning, the neutral stimulus of the clown is paired together with the unconditioned stimulus, of the balloon popping. At that point in time, it's still an unconditioned response of fear. If, however, that has been repeated or it's been a traumatic experience, then now the fear is associated to the clown. The clown has gone on to become a conditioned stimulus, and the clown just on its own, without the presence of the balloon, is enough to create a new learnt response of fear. Well done if you got all of that correct. If we flip that worksheet over onto the reverse, I'm just going to now take you through the next kind of skill that you are required to have for your Unit 1 exam. So it's all well and good kind of using all the right terminology for classical conditioning, but you do of course have to be able to write it out in a paragraph form. This tends to be the harder of the two tasks. The table of terminology, most people will get to grips with it, but writing it out in sentence or in paragraph form is a little bit further, okay? So you should refer to the terminology using abbreviations. If you want to, however, you could use the actual terms. You must be describing it in 3 stages, so before, during and after, and you must apply it to the stimulus if there is one provided. So I'm going to give you an example of how this would be done using Pavlov's dogs, and then you can have a little practice. So, in the Pavlov example, before conditioning, the bell was an NS, which produced no response, whereas the food was a UCS, which produced an automatic, brackets, UCR of salivation in the dogs. During conditioning, Pavlov repeatedly paired the NS, the bell, with the UCS of food. Eventually, the NS has become a CS, and the dogs had learnt a new CS of salivation to the bell as they had learnt to associate the bell with the food. So that's how we would put all of that terminology and that example of Pavlov into paragraph form. So what I would like you to do now is fill in bit of terminology, so what do those letters stand for initially, and then try practicing how to write it out in paragraphs in the 2 spaces provided. So we've got the Pavlov example. Try and do it on your own and then maybe rewind it and have a look at my example, and then a novel example. You need to bring in an example from real life. It can be any of the ones that we've mentioned so far if you find it easier to wrap it around that terminology, but I want to see everybody having practiced this at least a couple of times by Friday. So go ahead, pause that now, complete that worksheet, and then we'll mark that up on Friday. Okay. So, before we move into our next key concept, it's probably the better idea to complete the couple of exam questions first. You can always do it at the end if you want to, if that makes more sense to you, but the 2 exam questions are about classical conditioning rather than operant conditioning. So it's up to you where you choose to do that. So, moving into the next key concept then, this is operant conditioning. So this type of learning occurs through consequences of past behaviour. In other words, the consequences of our actions shape whether or not we decide to repeat or avoid that behaviour again. Do we want to do it again? So is it a repetition, or do we want to not kind of enforce that behaviour again? Have we learnt by, for example, punishment? Okay, have we learnt that by doing something, then there was a punishment that followed? That was the consequence, excuse me, of our action, and subsequently we don't want to repeat that. So, operant conditioning, if you've got your highlighter pens, was first discovered by a guy called Burhouse Skinner in 1932. And he initially investigated operant conditioning by training rats to press a lever inside of what he later called the Skinner box. And there were a series of consequences that the rats were faced with, some pleasant, some unpleasant, which shaped their behaviour of learning to repeat an action of pressing on a lever. Okay, so just to explain a couple of bits and bobs within the Skinner box. You do have, obviously, the lever straight in front of the rat. And as I said, they learn to press the lever in a number of different ways. One way in which he achieved lever pressing in the rats was every time they pressed the lever, either by accident or because it was now a learnt response, they got a food pellet for their actions. So it might have happened by accident on the first few occasions, but pretty quickly the rat became aware of the fact that every time they pressed the lever, a food pellet would be released, and then obviously they knew to keep doing that. Another consequence that the rats found within the Skinner box is that the floor was electrified. Okay, and you can see there it's a little bit like a cattle grid. It's an electric grid. Now, prior to that electric grid being switched on, so the floor becoming electrified, the little red light in front of the rat would flash, all right, as a signal that it was going to happen. Now, again, the first couple of responses were accidental in their nature, but once the floor became electrified, the rat almost panicked and just did whatever it could to try and turn it off. It quickly figured out that pressing the lever would switch off the electrified floor. And as time went past, the rats also discovered that the warning sign, all right, of that red light flashing meant that the current was going to be switched on. And some of the rats actually got to the point where they would press the lever in advance of the floor becoming electrified because they were responding to the red light. As soon as the red light flashed, they would press the lever and they would remove the electrified floor. So this is all what we call learning by consequence. So when we're talking about learning by consequences, there are two main categories that you need to know and understand. Consequence number one is reinforcement. Now, any type of reinforcement, because there are two types, increases the chance of you wanting to carry that behaviour out again. So reinforcement increases the chance that you're going to want to do it again. Stands to reason. Okay, if you get rewarded for something, then you're going to actively want to perform that again. However, there are two different ways in which this can be achieved. So number one, and probably what most of us would associate with reinforcement, is positive reinforcement. Now, positive reinforcement is when a behaviour is followed by a pleasant stimulus. I would always think of it in terms of like math symbols. So positive means to add. Okay, so if it's reinforcement, then you must be adding something pleasant. So positive reinforcement is the adding of a pleasant stimulus which increases the chances that you want to do it again. So for example, if a kid behaves or does something, pleasant, as showing manners or shows good behaviours, treating them with treats. Also, you could say that learning to brush the teeth, so we've got nice white teeth. Any of that is a pleasant stimulus or a pleasant consequence. That's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement tends to be a little more difficult to understand because if we're going with that same analogy of using the math symbols, negative means to remove something, but it's still reinforcement. So it's still a behaviour that we want to do again and again and again and again. So if we're thinking in those terms, to be negatively reinforced must mean to remove something unpleasant. Okay, so you're taking away something that you don't enjoy, which means that you'll repeat that behaviour. All right. So for example, if you do something positive, all right. So for example, if you hoover up and you get ungrounded, that's negative reinforcement. Okay, that means that you're going to repeat the behaviour of hoovering because you know that the grounding was removed as a result of it. All right, so that's reinforcement. And as I've just said, using the analogy of positive means adding and negative means taking away, that hopefully will help you get your head around the difference between the two. Same rules apply for punishment in terms of adding and taking away, but punishment obviously reduces the chances of you carrying out a behaviour again. So if it's positive punishment, adding something, which means that we're not going to carry out the behaviour again, then that clearly is something that you're not enjoying. So adding an unpleasant consequence. So when a behaviour is followed by an unpleasant stimulus, it means that we don't want to do it again. So for example, if you perform a behaviour and you get told off for it, it results in an argument, or if there's a physical punishment associated, hopefully you won't do that again. Negative punishment, on the other hand, is trying to get you to avoid repeating a behaviour by taking away something that you do enjoy. Okay, again, using kind of children and behaviour shaping, taking a PlayStation away. All right, following bad behaviour would be negative punishment. It's taking away something that you enjoy, that you find pleasant, so that behaviour is no longer repeated. So same thing, there's positive means adding, but it's adding something unpleasant, which means that you don't want to do it again. And negative is the reverse of that. So just very quickly, going back to your Skinner box, I'd like you to try and figure out the answer to these questions. Write them onto a sheet of paper for me, please. And again, we'll clarify them in lesson. But what was the positive reinforcement given to the rats? What behaviour did they learn to repeat as a result? What was the negative reinforcement given to the rats? And what behaviour did they learn as a result? So just try to pop those onto a piece of paper before we move on. Pause that here. Okay, and let's go ahead now and get your booklets filled in so that everything's kind of completed for us. So consequence 1 is reinforcement. We've already said these consequences will increase the probability that behaviour is going to be repeated, and positive reinforcement occurs when a behaviour is followed by a pleasant consequence. In Skinner's rats, the food pellet was a pleasant consequence, so they learned to repeat that lever pressing to get more food. Negative reinforcement involves removing something unpleasant, which makes it more likely to be repeated. In Skinner's rats, the unpleasant electric shock was removed, so they learned to repeat the lever pressing to turn off the shock. Moving into punishment, this is the consequence that reduces the probability of behaviour being repeated. There are 2 main types. Positive punishment is when a behaviour is followed by an unpleasant consequence, which weakens behaviour and makes it less likely to be repeated. Now I'd like you to go ahead and just cross out the example of Skinner's rats for punishment, because technically speaking, he never used positive and negative punishment. It was all positive and negative reinforcement. Instead, what I would like you to put in there is one of our own examples. So you might want to skip the video back and maybe listen to the examples that I gave you, or you can come up with your own, all right? But I don't want anything to do with Skinner's rats in there. Same thing for negative punishment. Remove the example of Skinner's rats and I'd like you to complete your own. So negative punishment is where a behaviour is followed by the removal of something pleasant, which weakens behaviour. So go ahead and do that for me now. Moving on to clarify your understanding before we move into the very last little chunk. I just want to check whether or not you've understood those 4 consequences. So go ahead now and complete the table on the top of page 10. And I'm not going to give you answers, so they're not on the next slide. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to mark these at the start of Friday's lesson and we'll see what your level of understanding is there. Okay? So now, guys, into the last little kind of key concept that I want to cover today, which is motivation. So we know that obviously operant conditioning is learning by consequence, but there are different types of motivators, okay? Different people are motivated by different things. And as far as we can tell, okay, the 2 main categories of people are people that are motivated by what we call extrinsic motivation, which is motivation that comes from outside of us, so we might want to add that into the booklet there in that little bracket space, or intrinsic, people who are motivated to perform just for its own sake rather than an external rewarder. Okay, so motivation either comes from outside, which is extrinsic, or inside, which is intrinsic. Figure out which one you are. Okay, to help you along with that, I'd like you to use these 8 examples and pop these in to your booklet. So on the top left hand side, extrinsic motivation, motivated to perform a behaviour or engage in activity because you want to earn a reward or you want to avoid punishment. You engage in a behaviour not necessarily because you like it, but you expect to get something in return or avoid something unpleasant. For example, doing your homework. Okay. Intrinsic motivation, where you engage in a behaviour because you find it rewarding rather than you doing it for the sake of the consequence. You perform the activity because you enjoy it rather than doing the activity to get an external reward. The behaviour itself is a reward. Can you think of any activities that you do because you just enjoy them rather than doing them because you have to? Use my 8 examples now and sort those into the right spaces in your booklet. Again, I have not provided you with the right answers here, so we will mark these on Friday. So take a moment now and sort those out. And then the very last thing that we want to kind of talk about is what causes us to become either an intrinsically motivated individual or an extrinsically motivated individual. Now, with extrinsic motivation, people are typically driven by either what we call tangible rewards or psychological rewards. Now, tangible rewards, if you want to add it on, are touchable, they are real, they are visible. So go ahead now and pop in some examples that would fit under that heading, okay? So a tangible reward. It's an external motivator, so it's something that you're getting, but it's a physical thing, okay? We can see it, we can touch it. Psychological rewards are obviously, as it says on the tin, they're not necessarily physical. These are just things that are psychological, but they're still gratifying nonetheless. So you can pop in the examples here. I've said praise, compliments, fame and popularity, okay? They're not physical entities, they're not tangible entities, but they are undoubtedly extrinsically rewarding to us. So they're psychological. And very last slide for this lesson, same thing, what causes intrinsic motivation? Intrinsic motivations are positive emotions that actually just come with carrying out the activity itself. So I'm going to go ahead and give you your examples. So these might be pride, empathy, happiness, just genuine sense of satisfaction, okay? So making sure we've got those examples filled in, but remember, just going backwards, you need to come up with the examples for tangible rewards. So that now is our booklet completed for both classical and operant conditioning. We'll do a little bit of checking of this on the Friday, and then we're going to go straight in with social learning theory. Once I'm happy that we kind of know what we're doing with the two types of conditioning. Okay, so well done for completing this, and I will see you all on Friday.